For those of you on the nostalgia train, a game that may come and go from your memory is Knox, the strange but amazing action RPG released by Westwood just a few years before EA completed their cannibalization of them, as they were known to do in the late 90s and early 2000s with pretty much every game company you loved. It's a common sentiment that it is a shame that there was never a Knox 2 release because of this, especially since there still exists a PvP scene for the original even to this day. And while some companies have come closer to spiritual successors for the game, there's yet to be one that captures the distinct mix of solid gameplay, unique approaches to problems, and the standard campy humor of late 90s Westwood Studios. I mean, seriously, I miss the days when games made fun of themselves in the intros like this.
Donande tak, donande tek, a rumenta sed. Damn.
Hun? You want bacon?
You know I do. Damn TV.
Lousy second-rate candle makers. Kill them all when I rule the world. What sort of half-baked operation do they think I'm running here? Now where was I? Dananda-tat, dananda-tat, da-da-da. Yeah. Oh yeah. I call upon the power of one dark name, one black heart, one grievous soul. I call upon the power of Grimorum Sanctissimum!
What the?
Now, as you can see, while the audio is perfect for the theme, the cinematics have not aged that well visually, thanks to the smooth beans that made up most 3D animation in the late 90s, and the fact that they were pre-rendered for CRTs and potato resolutions. But thankfully, the rest of the visuals fared a bit better in terms of keeping the cobwebs off. This mostly being due to the isometric perspective and detailed graphics, which usually age well. Though admittedly, on modern displays you will want a wrapper like DG Voodoo or DX Wind for sanity's sake, at least if you want the original experience. But that aside, as with most genres, gameplay is still one of the most important things, and Knox is still one of the best action RPGs to date in that regard, even though it sadly does lack in a few other departments that people might expect in modern action RPGs. This is because it was designed in an age where story and world came first, rather than post-game and grinding like most modern attempts. This means that, for your money, you'll get about 3 playthroughs of this rather than thousands of hours of farming rifts, maps, and what have yous, for better or worse. And literally no proper post-game, since when the story is done, the game is done for that character. Though you can still go through the infinite dungeon mode, and it is fun, just not nearly as engaging since it lacks the same motivations. The reason for 3 playthroughs, you might ask? The game does come with something somewhat uncommon at the time, and even uncommon today, at least to the extent provided, and that is how it has 3 distinct storylines in the same world, one for each class, where you'll go through the same areas in different order and drastically different receptions from the local population, with some towns even being overtly hostile to one class while being home to another. And even the mechanics of the playthroughs will differ fairly decently between each character, with the only real overlaps being all 3 having the line of sight system and physics, and of course the fact that this is one of the few games in the genre to include a jump button, which you will use throughout the playthrough to navigate terrain, bypass obstacles, and even avoid traps or attacks in some cases. As far as the individual playstyles, for the warrior, you are a tanky beast that focuses on dashes, slams, attacks, and well, repairing your gear incessantly until you get to the mid to late game and get access to an indestructible option, and is the only character that can wear heavy armor and the rather fun, albeit semi-useless in most situations, shields that reflect projectiles. He also gets some fun unique answers to traps and travel. The wizard on the flip side is squishy and wears only robes, but ends up getting spells to cover durability, damage, and even movement, and will be loving the mana pillars and potions to keep them topped off on the blue juice. Though you do get some of the most entertaining navigation skills and tricky combinations, which can be a ton of fun. The third character, and probably the crowd favorite for the story, is the Conjurer, which is sort of the middle ground between the other two, but he adds creatures and bows to the mix and is generally the class I'd recommend to new players, since you get medium armor, the ability to summon and control creatures, good bows for whenever you run out of mana, and also plenty of spell variety to keep you flexible. But he does lack some of the trickier stuff from the Wizard and the Warrior, but it makes up for it a bit whenever you get the ability to summon special exploding minions that cast up to 3 spells on death. All three are fun, though know if you choose the warrior, you'll end up fighting wizards, and if you play the wizard, you'll end up fighting warriors. The conjurer is weirdly the true neutral of the bunch, not really feeling loved or hated anywhere, and being focused around fighting mostly the traditional enemies of the game. Though regardless of which you pick, they all have campaigns catered specifically for them too, with puzzles and navigation challenges based around their skills, or in the case of the conjurer, even your ability to summon minions and the commands you can give them. So in the grand scheme of things, you are essentially getting 3 games in the genre for the price of 1, and the storytelling is on par or even slightly better than other action RPGs of the time. Even the endings and their associated dungeons are unique to each class. Now, that's not saying that it's some deep philosophical adventure that makes you reflect on life during any of the paths. Instead, it's very self-aware and more focused on balancing the tone between campy Saturday morning cartoon flavors and keeping you invested enough to want to progress forward towards your ultimate goal of conquering the unlucky necromancer lady who ripped you from your trailer park living room. Along the way, you will meet a handful of characters, each with distinct personalities and actually really solid voice acting even by today's standards in the games, even if the audio compression is a bit lower due to when it was made. It is easily on par with most modern titles, albeit, as you probably guessed, more tongue-in-cheek, so they have to do a bit more of the intentional cliché and comical undertone, rather than the overly serious and a little too British tendency of modern games in similar worlds. Now, the game is broken up into chapters that differ depending on the class you play, so you will get somewhat used to hearing the narrator punctuating your progress, but he is far from the only voice-acted line, since even the townsfolk, the random ones that don't really influence the story, have things to say. And really, each of the paths of progression makes sense, and when you encounter a specific zone, that zone will be familiar from the other paths in terms of how it's laid out, but what you encounter there will oftentimes be significantly different outside of a handful of instances where the dungeons are shared between the classes. This attention to detail really does give the game much better staying power than a lot of other games, both new and old. Now, it's not all sunshine and roses in the game. While the mechanics are good and the story is campy but solidly done, the item system leaves a bit to be desired. And it's not even the most obvious things, like the fact that items are class restricted, there's no crafting outside of the trap minion, and items are predictable by zone. These are actually fine since it's more story driven. The big problem, that is on par with the Diablo 2 stamina issue and that is an annoyance you can deal with but don't love, is the item durability, loot frequency, and carrying capacity. Items will get damaged and eventually break, which destroys them, so you will want to pay attention to your weapon display so you know when that is happening, and set aside your favorite weapon until you get another town to repair it. Armor is a bit less obvious, and more than once I've stopped and wondered why I was shirtless, only to realize I lost my favorite armor because I wasn't paying attention to it. Being aware of this means you need to answer it with one of 2 solutions. You either need to carry 2 or 3 sets of gear to rotate through, which can be handy since damage types do influence the game quite significantly, and you do have a weapon swap key for juggling 2 weapons, though you usually get the element you need in the areas you need it rather than before. Or you can just use what you find in the area as your favorite gear starts to get worn down, this meaning going from curated gear to slapping on whatever bronze, iron, or whatever weapon you stumble across and the armor you just nabbed from a vampire to cover the gap until you get to another town. This does result in some annoying micromanaging, and that would be mildly frustrating, but there's also an encumbrance system, meaning you can only carry so much of the loads of items that drop. So you have to choose between carrying spare gear or carrying items to sell more of for money, so you can buy new shinies easier later on. So I generally, at least on the warrior playthrough, which deals with it the most, favored going with the 1 gear set route and just picking up what I find and using it, just to sell it later to preserve my good stuff during longer stretches. Also, unlike a lot of action RPGs, you cannot really grind up your level or improve your stats. Sure, doing quests, killing enemies, and finding secrets give you experience, but enemies don't respawn. So there is a fixed amount of experience you can get in an area and a playthrough, period. Thankfully, the game is well balanced, so unless you're skipping everything humanly possible, and possibly even then, you will have everything you need to beat the game. With some saves and patience, it's actually able to be beaten without too much trouble. Probably the last major drawback is one I hinted at earlier. Getting it to run nice on modern systems can be fiddly at times. If you're using a single monitor setup, as long as your system can do the resolution, it'll work okay usually. But if you're running multi-monitor or want to be upscaling, then you will need to run it through something like DG Voodoo to make it a little bit more user-friendly. And also, depending on where you buy it and how you install it, the solo play option, or basically the infinite dungeon option I mentioned earlier, might not function properly. It's a fairly easy registry edit to fix it, but I know that is outside the comfort level of a lot of users. So in terms of accessibility on modern systems, it's a little bit more fiddly than even Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction, but it is still worth it in my opinion, and it's still not the worst one I've actually played on the channel. And really, I would say in terms of the history of action RPGs and their future in terms of actual design, Knox is kind of in that category of a must-try, especially if you're looking to design one with more proper mechanics, world building, and style, rather than microtransaction hell like most new games in the genre are stuck in. If you're looking for some other must-play action RPGs, check out the video on screen now, and if you found this an interesting dive into a classic game, hit some of those buttons beneath the video since it helps out a ton.